And you also shared a time when you were in a parade, when you were running for.
Oh, this was the state senate. Vienna has a Halloween parade every year, and the tradition is that all the candidates have these floats, and we had this big float on education, and my 4 kids were on the float, and I was pregnant with our 5th kid, Andrew. And one of my supporters, a fellow named Phil Merrill, who was the owner of the Washingtonian magazine, actually made up a big banner that he wanted to put over downtown McLean, which said, Kilberg produces for her district, or Bobby produces for her district. And I rejected that, and he was convinced I lost because of that. However, he may have been right, because in this parade, I was walking in front of the float. This was a nighttime parade. And we went in Vienna down Maple Street, and then you made a turn. You went back on Park Street, and at that time, Park Street was really, the houses were very close together, and they weren't very large, and it was a kind of a working class area. And so I'm walking there at this point, because Andrew was born in November, 8 months pregnant, and women came out of their houses, off their porches, and started walking with me and talking with me and taking my flyers and saying, I'm going to vote for you, I'm going to vote for you, you understand what it's like. It was a Democratic, solidly Democratic precinct, and I was running as a Republican. And, you know, it occurred to me that the reason they thought I understood them and they understood me was that I was pregnant. And indeed, that precinct went Republican for the first and only time. I'm sure it went Republican later, but at that time, for the first and only time in its history, and I don't know if it was the women or the men, because, you know, it's secret ballot, but it went Republican, never gotten Republican before. And I think it was because those women really did think, here's this woman who is pregnant, who has all these kids on this float, and she must understand what I'm going through and how hard it is to do everything.
So you look like a Mylar balloon. You got your kids with you, and that's
such
a great story.
It was the healthiest pregnancy I ever had, because I walked 27 precincts.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine being pregnant in the heat and walking precincts? And oh my gosh, I do. I know people have done it, but it's incredible. It's incredible. Okay, so let's skip now. I told you that's why we didn't spend a lot of time going over there, because each one of her journeys, her stops along her journey to success has been amazing. Let's skip to how you ended up running the MVTC. How did that happen? Because you're not a geek.
No, I'm not.
You couldn't fix my computer.
No, but before that, and I'll take maybe 1 minute on that and 2 minutes on MVTC, because we've left, the one thing that we've left out, which I think is important in regard to mentors, was the Bush 41 White House. And I wound up being the head of the Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of the Office of Public Liaison, which is the office now called the Office of Public Engagement under Obama, that deals with all the interest groups in the United States. And President Bush, I wound up in that, and there's that President Bush story, which I think is important,
right.
But I wound up in that because President Bush became my mentor. How did he become my mentor? I was at Yale Law School. Yale Law School was going co-ed. George W. Bush was on the co-ed committee. He was also, you also could, if you're in the law school, take an undergraduate course if you wanted to. I was in a history course with him. We became friends. His father would come up to see his son and to explain the, well, he was called up often to see his son, who had a tendency of getting into trouble. And we became kind of friends. And the president, not president then, the congressman then said, when you come to Washington, please come see me. And indeed I did, and he kind of adopted my husband and me, and we became part of their extended family. When Bush won in 1988, he called me into his office, in the vice president's office, and said, I want you to head public liaison. And I said, are you out of your mind? I have 5 children, and one is just this tiny little toddler. How can you possibly do that? And this guy, who was 67 years old at that time, or 66, said, we're going to make this work, and this is how we're going to make it work. I said, okay. He said, what do you need? I said, well, I'd like to take my kids to school in the morning, because if you don't start the day well, I don't think they end the day well. They said, okay. He said, well, you're going to miss the senior staff meeting, which was at 7:30. And I said, yes. He said, well, let me tell you a secret. He said, nothing happens at the senior staff meeting. It's all show and tell. He said, the real meeting's in my office afterwards with my 3 senior members of the staff, and you're not invited to that anyway. So he said, you go to 1 senior staff meeting a week and then send one of your deputies. He said, nobody will know the difference, and it'll be clear. And besides that, they know you're my person. We said, what's second? I said, well, I really would like to have my weekends free. And again, those were before email. There were secure phones. There were some faxes, but there were no emails, and not really any cell phones. And he said, okay, I make you a promise. You will not have to work on weekends. And so over a course of 4 years, I think maybe I went in 3 weekends, period. And then he said, what else? I said, well, I really don't want to be away at night a lot overnight. And so he said, you really don't want to go overnight in Air Force One, you know? And he said, people die for that. And I said, well, yeah, they do. But so he said, okay. And literally, I became the most popular member of the White House staff because I would send my staff to Europe, to California, to Canada with the president. I go to Peoria because you can come back on the same day. But he worked on that. And again, over 4 years, I think maybe 3 times, I wound up having to go on overnight trips with Air Force One rather than coming back the same day. And then he said, okay, so let's look at this. He said, the reality of this is you'll be able to do this job, you will do this job, you will not be part of the inner circle. And I said, well, that's right. He said, you won't be part of the inner circle because the guys will be there earlier in the morning than you will be, and at night, at 8, 9 o'clock at night, they're going to be sitting around drinking beer and having and wine. Guys drank wine those days too. And you're going to be home with your kids. And so you're not going to be one of the boys. And so there's just no way you can do that. He said, but you don't have to be one of the boys because you have my imprimatur and they know you're my person and therefore you will be part of this team. And for somebody who was 67 years old in 1988, that was really not only very prescient, but it was very important to me. And he enabled me to be able to do that job, which is a killer of a job. But I could do it because he set the guidelines and the standards, and he said, we will make this work, and we will make it possible for a woman with 5 children to be able to be in this White House. And he had other senior staff with kids as well. So
isn't that fascinating? So, I mean, that really to have such foresight and to say we can't make it work. And I think we all struggle with the idea, I can't do it all, have it all.
But you can't do it all, and you can't have it all. I mean, you can do things, but you have to give other things. Yeah. And you have to realize that, yes, if you want to have the kids and you want to be home, you're not going to be part of the little inner group. But that doesn't mean you can't function.
It's rare we run so long. I mean,
okay.
I knew that this would just be I knew you were a 3-parter. She's not a 1-part interview. So let's quickly
NVTC.
NVTC. How did you end up taking
that was the only one that I've ever quote, interviewed for, and that was a strange story too. My husband was getting on me because, after the White House, I ran for the nomination for lieutenant governor in Virginia. It was a convention. This is what relates to what happened. It was a convention. It was the largest convention in the history of Western democracy, 14,600 people, until the next year when Ollie North ran in a convention, and many of the people who were there in my convention in '93 were Ollie North types, which is one of the reasons I lost. At any rate, I ran against somebody who was the head of the then incipient religious homeschool movement, and I lost basically to the religious right. Be that as it may, he won fair and square. He then went on to lose the general election big time. But I then decided to stay home, and I really wanted to stay home with our youngest child, and I wanted to stay home until he got out of middle school, which at Potomac School was 6th grade. So I was at home. I was very active in the community. My husband started getting on me about year 5 and said, you really need to think about going back to work because people are going to forget who you are. And I said, well, if they forget who I am, that's their problem. But I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. But he really pushed me so hard that I said, okay. And I picked up a card of a fellow named Randy Jane, who many of you know here from High Drink and Struggle, who had just come back to the region, who had been a White House fellow talking about the interrelations, and who I'd seen at a party. And he said, you know, give me a call someday. So I called him and I said, Randy, do you have anything part-time that I can do? And he said, well, no. He said, everything part-time I have is not really going to interest you. He said, plus I do technology, and you don't know anything about technology. And he said, but let's do lunch, as you always say. And of course, we never did lunch. We just forgot about each other. 3 months later, I get this phone call. I'm at home, and it's Randy. And he said, hi. He said, I have something I want you to interview for. It is full-time, not part-time, which may be a problem for you. And he said, and it is technology, and you don't know anything about technology, but that's okay, because they think they need somebody who knows about technology, but they really don't. It's the Northern Virginia Technology Council, and they need somebody who understands management, who understands trade associations, which I did from heading the Office of Public Liaison in the White House and dealing with that all the time. And they need somebody who understands public policy and politics, and you'd be perfect and come interview. So I did interview. He was head of he's a search firm, obviously. I did interview. I was called back for the finals where they had the committee of the board, and they looked around the room, and of the 7 people on this committee, I knew 5 of them from the community. So precisely being home for those years and spending the time in the community wound up really being the reason, I think, that I wound up with the position, because I knew virtually everybody on that selection committee.